Hi, I'm Brian Gongol with DJ Gongol and Associates, and we're going to take a little ride through history. And by the end of this ride, you're going to find that it turns out that water was just as hazardous as bullets to the presidents of the United States until about the mid-20th century. It's quite the ride, so let's get started. It may sound like an oxymoron, but everybody knows about the Secret Service. It's not much of a secret. The problem for the Secret Service in their job protecting the president and other important leaders is that their failures are public, but their successes remain almost entirely private. This is a problem with which people in the water sector might be familiar. It's hard to get a lot of credit if you don't get to wave your successes around in front of people, but your failures make it to the front page of the news. In fact, if you look at the Warren Commission report, there's a whole section dedicated to the reaction by Secret Service agents, and it talks about their failures, their shortcomings. And sure enough, that's what happened to President Kennedy, as well as other presidents in both the 19th and 20th centuries. But if we go all the way back to the first president of the United States who was assassinated by a bullet, we have President Abraham Lincoln in 1865. He didn't have the protection of the Secret Service at the time. It was actually Pinkerton guards who were providing protection, Pinkerton's being a private security agency. So these Pinkerton guards failed in 1865 to protect Lincoln from the assassination that took place at the hands of John Wilkes Booth. But let's go back a little bit further than that, to 1864. A doctor from Kentucky who was sympathetic to the Confederate cause was not particularly pleased with the way the Civil War was going, but he was working not in the South, but rather in Bermuda. And in Bermuda, he was treating people who had yellow fever. Now, he's a doctor. He's working to try to save lives in Bermuda. It turns out, though, he thought, well, if this is a disease that's killing people and I have people that I would like to kill, maybe I can get them by shipping clothing back, infected clothing from patients who had yellow fever in Bermuda, and we're going to send that all the way back to the Yankees and see who he can off. Well, it turns out that it didn't work. It wasn't a successful plot because he was using the wrong vector of transmission. Yellow fever isn't transmitted via infected clothing. So shipping these crate loads of clothing back to New York City and back to Washington, D.C. wasn't a way that you were going to kill off people who were living there at the time. It's actually spread by viruses that are transmitted by diseases, by mosquitoes. Mosquitoes are the cause for all this. It's not going to be something that you're going to get from clothing. Now, the thing about this is that it's an early example of bioterrorism. And these bioterrorists, because it was a plot, there were others involved, could have gotten much farther if they've gone after Abraham Lincoln's drinking water instead of trying to infect him with clothing that might somehow spread the disease. An assassin's bullet had killed one president of the United States by the time D.C. had a complete water and sewer system. That would have been Abraham Lincoln. But bad water by that time had already killed at least 3 presidents. It's a pretty shocking figure. It took until 1901 for us to assign the Secret Service to actually have presidential protection duties. So it wasn't until after the turn of that 20th century that we finally got around to providing full-time protection delivered by a government agency to try to keep presidents safe. But it took until 1850 for us to install the first sewers in Washington, D.C., the very first stage of protection against the president getting sick from contaminated water. So those first D.C. sewers were installed along Pennsylvania Avenue. And we're going to keep coming back to some videos or some maps of Washington, D.C. from that time period, because you'll see there are certain things that are familiar and certain things that are unfamiliar to us today. We have the White House, the president's house. We have the Capitol on Capitol Hill, as you may be familiar. And here's the National Mall. We're pretty familiar with those locations. Anybody who's visited Washington probably has a decent bearing for where these places are. But you may be noting that the Potomac River here is taking up a whole lot of space that today is occupied by some of our most famous monuments, the Washington and the Lincoln memorials, for instance, as well as the Jefferson Memorial. Those are all here underneath the Potomac River at the time. This is important for us to remember. The population of Washington, D.C. in 1850, we're going to use that kind of as our baseline here, was 51,687 people. Not a huge city, but also not tiny. Large enough that we would expect it in contemporary days to have a full and complete set of water and sewage utilities. The problem here is that they're just getting around to installing sewers in Washington, D.C. in 1850. And sewers are a really good start at taking care of sanitation and public health, but they are far from enough. It's certainly not enough just to get the water to someplace else. There's a lot else that goes into this. It wasn't even until the 1890s that Washington, D.C. finally started discharging its sewers downstream of the city. Now this is pretty important. Again, we have the White House, we have Capitol Hill, we have the river going by, and you can see we have this area that's marshy. It's got water, and it's situated where it won't go anywhere. We're discharging out into that river. It's still going right past a huge population base. We need to get that waste at least downstream of where we're living. It took them at least until the 1890s to figure that out. How big was Washington, D.C. by 1890? Turns out 230,000 people were living in the city at the time. Almost 250,000 people were living in Washington, D.C. before they finally got those sewers discharging at the downstream end of town rather than throughout the city. The problem that we have for Washington, D.C., which is, again, where the president lives, is that the swamp, as people like to call it, is actually a swamp. It's literally called the tidal basin. It's the tidal basin because it goes up and down with the tides. Here we have the Washington Monument. Here we have the Jefferson Memorial. This is that area that had been under the Potomac River back in 1850. We filled it in to some extent. We've made it an area where we've put things on display, but it's literally here at sea level. It's just not very high. Now, I've been in Scouts for a long time. I was an Eagle Scout myself. I put my kids through Scouting today. I'm a big supporter of the program. One of the things that you learn in the program is that if you go hiking or you go camping, first of all, take clean, safe water with you. But if you find yourself in a pinch and you don't have any kind of water available and you're really in an emergency, your choices, if you have them, and it's between warm, still water and cool running water, you always pick the cool running water. You pick the cool running water because it at least has a chance of being at least somewhat aerated, somewhat fresh, having moved somewhere. It's when water sits and gets stagnant that diseases break out. That's our biggest problem. Now, just because it's cool and running doesn't mean that it's perfect, but it's at least a start. It's when we let that water sit and stagnate that it really becomes a huge object and obstacle to public health. If your drinking water happens to share a water table with latrines and untreated combined sewers, which is all that Washington, D.C. had at the time in the mid-1800s, then really what happens is you end up living in a doom loop of illness. This is an elevation map of Washington. Here's the White House. The highest point on the White House lawn, 60 feet above sea level, which means if you are digging anywhere to get water, you don't have much choice but to be digging in an area that is at least cross-contaminated by the water that's sitting in the water table in that tidal basin, but it also means that those untreated combined sewers, those latrines, those pits, all of those things are feeding into the same water table from which you can't escape. That's a really big obstacle to health. The first president it ends up taking out is in 1841, William Henry Harrison. Now, you've probably heard the myth of William Henry Harrison. William Henry Harrison supposedly was the guy who went up and gave an inaugural address that was too long. And he gave it in the cold, and he refused to wear a coat, and he caught a cold and died. It's the kind of story you end up hearing from Mom when she wants you to wear your coat when you're about 6 or 7 years old. Now, it's true that he gave an inaugural address that was huge, record-setting, in fact, enough to fill the entire front page of a newspaper and all but just a hair of a second page. There's no ads, no pictures, nothing here to take any kind of breaks. He was talking for far too long, but it didn't give him a cold that killed him. It's not possible. That's not how it works. We know that that's not how people die. What did the doctor actually say? Because obviously the president dying in office is a pretty newsworthy event. We actually have the report of his attending physician here noting symptoms of fever, derangement, as they call it, of the stomach and bowels. We have profuse diarrhea that came on, not to mention a cough. The cough is why people refer to it as something that was a cold. It's just not true. The fact of the matter is, here's what it's like to get typhoid fever, sustained fever, weakness, stomach pain, headaches, constipation or diarrhea, cough, loss of appetite. These things that are highlighted in yellow, by the way, all the symptoms that William Henry Harrison had just before he died. The guy didn't die because he gave an inaugural address that was too long. He died because he came to Washington, D.C. and started drinking contaminated water. The water's what killed him, because typhoid gets transmitted through food, drinks, and water that have been contaminated by sewage, or food that's been in contaminated water, or food that's been touched by contaminated hands. We're going to come back to that point in a bit. This is how you die when you're experiencing contact with contaminated water. And that's what Washington, D.C. had at the time of William Henry Harrison. But But he's not the only guy who gets killed by this. In 1849, James K. Polk leaves office, gets done with being president, goes to move home. And as he goes home, he contracts cholera. Now, how do we know that it's cholera that he caught? Contemporaneous accounts tell us. Here's an account from somebody who was with him at the time he died. Points out here explaining that he died of, he actually first of all contracted a disease which assumed the character of disease in the form of chronic diarrhea, as well as having fatigue and a slight fever. This is a pretty unfortunate way to go. Polk continued to gradually sink from day to day. The disease was upon him 4 days before his death, but his constitution was so weakened, there was no way for him to recover and recuperate. This sounds like a pretty bad way to go. Unfortunately, it also sounds like what happens when a person contracts cholera. Again, here are the different symptoms that we get when people get cholera. Watery diarrhea, the severe dehydration, loss of more than 10% of body weight is possible. And then your organs start to fail. You lose your kidneys. You end up going into shock. You end up going into a coma, which fits with this narrative of him basically passing out. This is what happened to James K. Polk. It was going around at the time. It turned out that in 1849, we were dealing with a whole lot of cholera going around. And how was cholera transmitted? Well, once again, typically from encountering water that's been contaminated by human waste. That's the best vector, the most effective vector for transmitting cholera around. This is what's problematic for us. If we don't get away from this problematic water, we're going to keep losing people over and over and over again. And the real problem here that we have is that cholera was this massive killer in the 1800s. So bad, in fact, that this is the city of Paris imploring heaven to take away the plague of cholera, a statue built in 1851. Cholera was going back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean, and it was going all over the world. It was truly a pandemic kind of instance. In the United States, because we had exchange and trade and immigration going back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean, couldn't escape what was happening in places like Europe. We'd catch a wave of it, we'd send it right back again, and then it would come back across, and then it would go back over again. We bandied it back and forth over and over and over again. It's a pretty tragic event because they didn't understand how cholera was being spread at the time. There were major cholera epidemics in the United States in 1832, 1849, 1866, and 1873. Now, my great-great-grandfather was born in 1823. He immigrated to the United States from Ireland. He would have seen major epidemics of this disease at ages 9, 26, 43, and 50. As someone who's in the middle here between these two latter dates, I'm trying to think through just how awful life would have been to have gone through 3 major pandemics, nobody knows how they're being spread, and then have another one yet to go before I'm even out of middle age. This is a terrible way to live. That 1832 outbreak that went through the United States killed 3,500 people in New York City alone. 3,500 people would be a huge number today, but it was a massive number when New York City was even smaller than it is now. The 1849 outbreak killed 5,000 people in New York City. That's a pretty dreadful disease to be going around. It was so bad that it made front page of the newspaper for them to periodically update every day how many people were dying, how many cases were out, how many had died, how many had been discharged from the hospital. Turns out, the number of cases is a large number, the number discharged a very small number, the number of deaths very high. Front page news, because people were getting a dreadful disease that we didn't fully understand how it was being spread. The 1849 to 1851 outbreak, because again, it was going back and forth and being spread across the Atlantic Ocean, coming back over. It was being spread around the country as well. Killed 5 to 10% of the populations of cities like St. Louis and Cincinnati and Detroit. Not as big as they are today, but imagine wiping out 5 to 10% of the entire population of a city because of a dreadful disease that's going around that you and I know today happens to be because of contaminated water. It's an awful, awful way to go, and it probably killed the president too. People are familiar with the Washington Monument, right? We know that over time they had fundraised and they built part of it, and then they ran out of money, they didn't finish the job, and they were trying to raise funds to finish. And that's why there are 2 different colors that go into the Washington Monument. That's one of the things that's a signature about it. Well, in 1850, Zachary Taylor, President of the United States, dies just after a 4th of July celebration at the partially completed Washington Monument, trying to build awareness and interest to help them raise some more money. In 1850, though, poor Zachary Taylor there goes to this 4th of July event, gets sick, Contemporary history, a biography at the time says, he comes back to the White House, he's feeling ill, ate heartily of cherries and wild berries, and then was seized by cramps. Now, you and I know that eating a lot of cherries doesn't cause you to die. That's just not how it works. We do know, however, that if you're eating contaminated food, drinking contaminated water, or having food that's been touched by unwashed hands, that's a pretty good way to pass around dreadful diseases. So here we have that he's told at dinner by his doctor, against the remonstrances of Dr. Weatherspoon, don't eat any more cherries, Mr. President. Don't do it. It'll kill you. And then he dies. Now, the thing about it is that we go back and find out what had actually happened. Well, it turns out that he had died, and he died of the chronic type of, here they say, dysentery. It was either dysentery or cholera. We can't really go back because we're not able to really do the forensic work to exhume the body and figure out what it was now. But we do know that these both have similar cases. They both look a lot the same. What's it like to get dysentery? Diarrhea, nausea and vomiting, upset stomach, stomach cramps. These are all the same symptoms that we see from Zachary Taylor's experience. It wasn't that he ate too many cherries. It's that he was eating and drinking from waters that had been contaminated by human waste. Now, you and I can go and buy relief. Anytime you get a case of some stomach upset, you can go to a gas station and buy things like antidiarrheal medications for $2.99. Doesn't get a lot cheaper than that. It's the easiest way for us to recover from something like this. And then we can safely rehydrate from any drinking fountain anywhere. Water is safe for us to drink when it comes from well-run public water systems. The miracle of this is that we can go and drink safe water, rehydrate, take a couple tablets, and be on the way. We can consider it no more than a mild nuisance to come down with most things that give ourselves stomach upset. Back then, though, even the President of the United States of America had no choice but to seek relief in the very same water that was probably what was making him sick in the first place. When we use the phrase one water, when we talk about the importance of seeing that all water is recycled over and over and over again, so we have to both treat it carefully on the way to distributing it to people and then manage it well after it's been used by people. This is what we're talking about, folks. This is exactly the problem that DC historically was dealing with, was that they kept getting caught in these doom loops, and people would get sick over and over and over again because they couldn't escape it, because they're sitting right there at the water table. They can't get away from it. And remember, the DC population at the time that all of these presidents are dying is about 50,000. It's a modestly sized city of this day. At that time, it was big, but it certainly isn't huge. They had a lot of growth they still had to go through. And remember, DC was a city that had been very meticulously planned, but they hadn't planned about the safety of water because they didn't fully understand what was going into it. In 1854, though, the hero of the water sector, as well as of epidemiology, John Snow, comes along and conclusively demonstrates that that Broad Street pump in London was causing a cholera outbreak. You probably know the story. It's the one story that everybody in water is really probably supposed to know about epidemiology. This is 1854. It's a couple of years after all of these presidents have died. And even up until that point, people were treating Snow's analysis with skepticism. Snow goes to the authorities and says, look, I've mapped out where people are dying of cholera in this community. It draws a bullseye around this water pump. I think the water's what's killing people. Please take the handle off the pump and let's see what happens. They take the handle off the pump, people stop being able to drink from it, and sure enough, people start to survive. We're not seeing as many deaths. They have to go to other sources. The real problem is that later on they excavated and found that, sure enough, there was a cesspit that was about 3 feet of soil away from the water well. That cesspit contained things like babies' diapers, and they were contaminated with cholera. That's why people were getting the disease. But nobody listened to Snow, really, at the time. He had to do this really difficult job of convincing the authorities to listen to him then. And it was still decades before people really acknowledged what it was, because they thought, in many cases, that cholera was being transmitted via the air. We know that not to be the case today. But the problem is what Snow was trying to tell them was so disgusting, really, so naturally and instinctively uncomfortable and unpleasant that nobody wanted to listen to him at the time. It's difficult to tell people, hey, people are drinking raw sewage, and you don't want that, and that raw sewage is going to make you sick, and in some cases, cause people to die. That same 1854 outbreak that John Snow was discovering in London and figuring out the root cause of, it kills 2,000 people in New York City. There's a reason why when people were being brought over to the United States, they had to sit in quarantine for a period of time. And we actually had islands where people were held in quarantine to keep them from spreading diseases once they came over. A lot of the concept was thought that it was from airborne diseases. We should have been watching their water. That was the real problem. That same outbreak killed 1,500 people in Chicago. Now, you don't have to know the intimate history of Chicago, or you don't have to know it intimately to know that this is before the Great Chicago Fire. And the Chicago Fire was early in Chicago's history, relatively speaking. So Chicago losing 1,500 people in 1854, that was a town of 66,000 at the time. Again, about the size, a little bit bigger maybe than Washington, D.C. had been in 1850. This means that cholera killed 2% of the entire city of Chicago. 1 out of every 50 people. That's a huge death toll to take. 2% here. We were talking about rates of maybe even 10% in places like St. Louis and Detroit. These are big numbers. The problem for us is that it's a historical figure. It seems abstract, it seems distant. But you know what? If you think that was a long time ago, my own great-grandfather was born in 1860. I'm not that far removed from these events taking place here in America. But we don't talk about these things. These don't get transmitted well, because especially if this generation doesn't know what caused the dreadful diseases and they survived, they don't have a lot of reason to tell the next couple of generations what it was. So we have to go up the chain to figure out the causes and to figure out why it's so important to stick with our science today. But at the time, that information wasn't getting transmitted. Waterborne diseases were a massive cause of death, a leading cause of death in the 1800s. If we just look at the census of 1850, of all causes of death, we have 323,000 people who died. Cholera here gets listed as 1, 2, and 3. It is alphabetical order, but it also is one of the highest ranking causes. 31,000, 3,000, 1,000 different forms of cholera being grouped together. Diarrhea getting listed here as a killer of more than 6,000 people. Dysentery killing off 20,000. Typhoid fever, 13,000. You add all those numbers together, these waterborne diseases killed 75,000 people or more out of 323,000 deaths in a year in the United States. That's a huge death ratio for waterborne diseases to be causing. And if people didn't understand why or what to do about them, that's a huge problem. And by the way, that's just the death toll. Those cholera epidemics in the 1800s often killed as many as 1/5 of the people infected. So of all of those deaths that we see, probably there are 4 times as many people who survived, but maybe only through good luck, really, because if we didn't understand how it was being transmitted or how to get away from it or how to rehydrate even, how to do that all safely, then all of these people are suffering needlessly and this one's croaked. That's a really terrible track record for us to have, and it took a lot for us to start figuring that out. And the thing that's shocking really today is if you look at these concentrated death rates of anywhere between 2 and 10%, not trivial, really, really big numbers. Let's compare that to recent experience for us in the United States. The COVID-19 epidemic killed about 1.2 million out of 330 million or so living in this country at the time, about 0.4%. And that was enough for us to shut down the world, okay? That shut down everything. People were essential workers and everybody else was sent home. The water sector had to keep on showing up. That was because of a death rate, a concentrated death rate of 0.4%. We were talking about 2 to 10% in places that had really bad outbreaks of cholera. Think about how much bigger that is than even this most awful, most terrible, most life-destroying pandemic of our lifetimes. It's a magnitude of difference. In fact, think of how we would have reacted to this. A 2% death rate would be 5 times the mortality rate from COVID-19 in the US. A 10% death rate, like we had again in some of these cities at the time, is 25 times the death rate from COVID-19. That's a huge rate. So it's almost certain that every one of us knows at least one person who died of COVID-19, probably more. Take every person that you know who died in that epidemic, in that pandemic that we experienced ourselves, multiply that number by 25. Think of what it would have done to have shut down our world if this had been the death rate. And it wasn't just once. Remember, my great-great-grandfather saw 4 of them in his lifetime. 4 different waves of these epidemic outbreaks. This is a complete catastrophe, especially if we don't know what's causing it, what's behind all of this. The real wonder to all of this is why it took so long to figure out that bad water is what was killing so many people. Think of this. At the time that all this is taking place, Chicago is a growing city. It has a downtown area, but they realized that they need to get the water to go someplace else. Now, they weren't really making the connection yet that it was all about disease. They just realized that they were living right on Lake Michigan and the water wasn't draining away, so it was just a muddy, sloppy mess. It was a real problem. So they first decided they were going to start building sewers. They literally went through and raised the buildings in downtown Chicago using things like hydraulic lifts to raise the buildings. In this case, they're describing a big hotel that was raised 4 feet and 2 inches to grade. That's how much higher they raised it just to make room to put in drainage-type sewers. And that was just a bare start. But it was so bad, the situation was so intolerable that it made more sense to literally physically raise the buildings up to put sewers in than to keep on going the way they'd been going. That's pretty shocking. And again, that's happening right into the 1850s and 1860s. It was a long-term project that took through Chicago. Now, sewers, of course, are also the kind of thing you would want if your cities and streets are full of horses. Here's a little story from 1866 when it turns out one General Grant, recognizable fella, was caught speeding as he's going down the roads in Washington, D.C. He wasn't speeding in a car. He was racing horses. Horses, also being mammals like ourselves, are really good at dropping things that are unpleasant around the entire community. This was what life was like. This is why even the beginnings of sanitation were a massive improvement in the quality of life for Americans. DC only really started getting around to building a real sewer system in 1871 to 1874. So again, we have gone decades now after we've lost 3 different presidents to waterborne diseases, and we're only starting to build this real sewer system by the mid-1870s in Washington, D.C. Historically speaking, we generally have a normal series of events that take place. First of all, sewer systems go into place because drainage is essential even if you don't realize, even if you're not aware of the health aspect to it. It's just unpleasant to have too much water sitting around a city making everything muddy. So sewers tend to come first just to provide basic forms of drainage. Then we end up having water systems that come in because people realize when they're drinking water if it doesn't taste good. So we start finding sources of clean water and distributing it that way. It's only after we get those 2 steps done that we finally get around, in terms of historical features, to getting around to actually providing wastewater treatment before we send the water back into the sources from which it came in the first place. Now, how long did it take for good municipal water to come to Washington, D.C.? They first started building the Washington Aqueduct, a system to bring in water from upstream of where all these sewers were discharging from the city. They only started to do this in 1852, again, after we've killed off these 3 different presidents from bad drinking water. So they start constructing this Washington Aqueduct to bring that water in from 1852 onward. Again, too late for 3 dead presidents. Then they finally get around to doing sand filtration, the most basic form of water treatment before distribution, in 1905. Again, 4 years after we've started to implement the Secret Service to protect the presidents from bullets. We only begin to do filtration in 1905. By that time, Washington, D.C.'s population was about 280,000 people. Now, I come from the Midwest. I work in Iowa and Nebraska. This is bigger than the population of the city of Des Moines proper today. It's just shy of Lincoln, Nebraska's 290,000 people. Lincoln is the 2nd largest city in the state. That's a huge population before they even begin to filter the water, much less trying to disinfect. That takes a long time to get around to, and that's important. When did that very first drinking water system in the United States begin to do disinfection? Turns out it was 1908. And the person who wrote the paper about it, published by the Proceedings of the American Water Works Association, was one George Warren Fuller, a familiar name to those of us familiar with the Fuller Award. Jersey City, New Jersey, in 1908 becomes the first U.S. water treatment plant to chlorinate water, to really perform disinfection, not just filtration, but disinfection. It's 1908, though, by the time this has happened. We've gone a long way down the road. It's 1923 before D.C. starts chlorinating. They're 15 years behind Jersey City in Washington, D.C. That's when they finally get around to chlorinating to cause disinfection of the water that's already been filtered. The population by that time, 440,000 people in Washington, D.C. It's nearly 500,000 people before anybody's drinking water that's been disinfected in that city. Pretty stunning. Now, by the way, you may note the sudden decrease in dead presidents from waterborne diseases right about that time that the Washington Aqueduct comes into operation. It's not a coincidence. It turns out that by getting the water from a safer source, it was a start towards protecting the president and everybody else in the community from that bad water. But we also have to note that contaminated water didn't just kill presidents by the glass. It wasn't just what they were drinking that killed them. In 1881, James Garfield becomes the second president to be assassinated violently by a bullet. So in 1881, James Garfield gets shot. Now, the bullet itself didn't kill him right away. In fact, he probably would have survived, according to at least modern medical analysis, except for a massive and colossal failure of hygiene. See, Garfield's doctors, attending physicians, thought it was really important that we get that bullet out. We don't want him to die of lead poisoning, apparently. So they went searching for it, over and over and over again. So they're constantly probing into his body, into his belly, to try to find the bullet, to take it out. He was going to be fine if you'd left it in, but the doctors kept looking for it. And the problem is, they were doing it without washing their hands. Hand washing and disinfection of the hands wasn't a common practice among doctors in 1881. The doctors kept probing around in his body for the bullet using unwashed hands. And what he really died of was a massive sepsis infection. By the way, Abraham Lincoln also was attended to by doctors who poked unwashed fingers into his skull. Probably would have died one way or the other, but it didn't help situations. Hand washing, though, simply wasn't common practice at the time of James Garfield's assassination. And even if it had been common practice, remember, we're still 42 years before Washington, D.C. is even going to bother disinfecting its drinking water system. So even if they had been hand washing, we'd been counting a lot then on the wellness of the soap's effectiveness, because it wasn't going to be coming from disinfected water. The water they were drinking may have been filtered, wasn't yet by 1881, but even if it had been filtered, it was a long time from being disinfected. So they were still using these dirty hands. And these are our doctors who are doing this work. Joseph Lister published his paper on disinfection and the importance of doing this in 1867. You may be familiar with that name, Lister. It may kind of ring a bell. Listerine is named in honor of Joseph Lister. But he writes this paper in 1867 on the antiseptic principle in the practice of surgery. 1867, he gets the word out. But the practice wasn't adopted. It's just like the problem with cholera. Sometimes things are unpleasant to think about. Doctors don't want to be told they're killing their patients because their hands are dirty. They're going to deny that, no matter how much evidence mounts. It's a really unpleasant thing to try to be grappling with. Nobody wants to be told that they're responsible for killing their patients. So they ignored the advice and ignored it some more. And so then we have in 1881, James Garfield getting shot, his abdomen becoming infected, and he dies in agony. Poems written about this. James Garfield from the cradle to the grave. For 80 days so racked with pain, this strong man struggled all in vain. Because he had an infection. He would have been fine with the bullet. Lots of people have fragments of things lodged in their bodies and they survive. Our bodies are incredibly adaptable. They're not particularly adaptable to dirty doctors' hands going in over and over and over again, trying to find something on the inside of the gut. And that's what kills him. He suffered from July 2nd until his death from sepsis on September 19th of 1881. This coming summer, just think. Start your clock on July 2nd and wait all the way through until September 19th. And imagine how agonizing that must have been for that long. The really shocking part to all of this is that the Transcontinental Railroad, a marvel of engineering, one of the most amazing, astonishing civil works achievements that we've ever seen, was achieved and completed in 1869. We're well before the time when James Garfield's getting probed around with dirty fingers. We had the know-how, the knowledge, the scientific and technological and engineering understanding to build a transcontinental railroad, but not enough sense to make sure that we were washing our hands and drinking disinfected water. That's pretty astonishing. So they had all this amazing engineering know-how, but not enough to figure out soap and water, which means if somebody were to need surgery today, they'd be safer in any common rest area along an interstate highway than they would have been in the doctors' or physicians' or surgeons' rooms or offices of 1881. That's pretty shocking, but we've come a long way. But how much do people know about this? By the way, what else happened in 1881, the year James Garfield died because those doctors weren't washing their hands? That was the founding of the AWWA. Now, you can't have good hand washing unless you have good potable water. I mean, it's a start to have soap around, but it's not enough. There's a lot more. You just simply need to have water that will not contaminate over and over again, or else you're just fighting that doom loop that we're talking about over and over again. And you can't have that good, safe, potable water without good rehabilitation of the water that's gotten sick. Now, I think it's really important to stop here for a moment because we end up calling it wastewater. I think that's a mistake. I think we should call it unwell water. The reason being, it is safe and effective and healthy by the time it makes it to the consumer. By the time the consumer is done with it, though, it is often itself sick, contaminated. It needs rehabilitation. It's not waste. It's just something that needs help. It needs that rehabilitative effort. It needs to effectively go to the water hospital. And that's what water and wastewater treatment are all about, is rehabilitating water that has gotten sick through our behavior as human beings. Now, if you're keeping count, we are up to 3.5 presidents now killed by water in the first century of the Constitution of the United States. I'm going to give James Garfield a half count. So 3.5 presidents killed by this by the middle of the 1800s and by the first century of the Constitution. It's 1890 before we build the first real wastewater treatment plant in the United States. That's in Worcester, Massachusetts. 1890, we start to rehabilitate the wastewater before we put it back into places where we're going to drink it from all over again. But this is the very first such plant. It's 1895 before the first modern septic tank is eventually patented, and we start to put that into place. It's a very slow set of steps toward getting to treating it as one water that we should be serious about all the time. But this unsafe water wasn't just bad for presidents of the United States. If you ever happen to go to Mount Vernon to visit George Washington's home, here's his outhouse. It's a 4-holer. Let's not talk about the conversations that were taking place there. This is what you have if you're the President of the United States and one of the wealthiest people in the country. This is it. Everybody else has even worse. The problem that we have here is that we're at the greatest risk of backsliding when those convenient explanations take the place of the really harsh realities that we're grappling with. What do I mean by this? I mean that when we say that we're doing water and wastewater treatment to protect the environment, it's just not true. It's not what we're really here and doing our work about. What we're really trying to do isn't protecting the flowers and the trees and the fish and the birds. We're doing this for human beings, for human health. This work is every single day about preventing massive amounts of needless human suffering. Massive, unbelievable, astonishing amounts of suffering that we stop because we're protecting the water, not just for the president, not just for the rich, not just for the powerful, not just for the well-connected, for absolutely everyone. That's what public water systems are all about. That's what we're trying to do, is prevent human suffering on a scale that we're just not even familiar with in the modern world. We just don't even think about it. Even the people who work in our sector rarely stop to realize just how catastrophic things were before our work got out in a really serious way. And our problem stems from this intergenerational amnesia that we deal with. Again, not passing down the information from generation to generation about just how awful things were back in the old days, mostly because it's unpleasant and there's a survivorship bias. The people who survive don't tell the stories about dying. They don't tell the stories of misery, so we don't pass that along. So this amnesia is a problem. This is a report from the Sanitary Committee of the Board of Health of Philadelphia on the subject of the Asiatic cholera, published in 1848. Again, when we're having one of those periodic cycles of cholera going back and forth. In this, they note the rates of death to cases continue to be 1 to 2.5 or 3. They're saying that a third of the people who catch this cholera die. This is the kind of thing that gets forgotten, and then people don't talk about it, and if people don't talk about it, they don't appreciate the preventive measures being taken today to make water safe all the time, and to deliver that safe water effectively, economically, reliably. That's what we're doing every single day. And the fact is that the illnesses that we're preventing by providing safe water on a daily basis, these illnesses are really unpleasant to talk about. These things make people uncomfortable. People naturally don't want to respond to and listen to stories about things like diarrhea. It's incredibly unpleasant. But the fact of the matter is we're preventing those bad things from happening. We should talk about the prevention because those things are unpleasant. But it's harsh reality that we're dealing with here. And if we're not talking about and grappling with that harsh reality, people forget why we do it and why it's so important. If people realized that they were being protected from diseases that were going to wipe out a third of the people who got them, maybe we wouldn't have to fight so hard to get good infrastructure funding for water and wastewater treatment. But we don't tell the story well enough, and so the story doesn't get told to anybody because who else is going to tell it? They reversed the flow of the entire Chicago River, in 1900, just to keep sewage from flowing into Lake Michigan, which is the place where they were getting their water from. 1900. So we're talking quite some time ago. Didn't have all the technology we have today. They still went to the massive, unbelievable effort to reverse the flow of the river to keep that from happening. This was after Chicago had started building what they call their water cribs back in 1865. It's when they started building their first ones. These are out more than a mile, in some cases 2 to 4 miles, out from shore in Lake Michigan. These are large, it's big enough you can see it from the shoreline, large facilities to capture water and put it in a tunnel and take it back into the city. Why did they have to build these things? Because the water closer to shore was being contaminated with all the sewage and with everything else that was being dumped in or washed in from the storms. This was a massive effort. The first one was built 2 miles offshore, and it sends its water out to the very well recognizable and well-known water tower, the Landmark, on Michigan Avenue. That water tower and the pump station across the street from it, these were used to pump the water out to the city. They were collecting water from the middle of Lake, well, not the middle, but at least a couple miles out to Lake Michigan. But these massive water cribs that were built were a huge engineering effort. This is something that we did again in 1900, is when we finally get around to doing something to reverse the flow of the Chicago River into Lake Michigan. It took Chicago, though, until 1922, after they built these water cribs out to shore in the mid-1860s, after they've reversed the flow of the Chicago River, they finally get around to doing the first water reclamation facility, the Calumet plant. The Calumet plant, by the way, is one of the first in the country. They tunneled miles under Lake Michigan and reversed the flow of an entire river before they figured out how to just simply treat the wastewater safely before returning it back to the environment. It's not about the environment, it's about the human beings who are out to drink the water. That's who we did it for. That's what made it so important. And Chicago, by the way, was one of the very first. The Calumet plant was one of the first 10 activated sludge plants built in the United States. Everybody else was catching up. This is the mid-1920s now by the time we're talking about this. Having sewers isn't good enough unless you rehabilitate the water that people are drinking. Again, Chicago raised all of the downtown area in that 1860s to 1870s period just so they could build sewers, but the sewers weren't good enough. They still had to build those water cribs. They still reversed the flow of the Chicago River. They still didn't get around to building the plant to rehabilitate the water. Now, clearly, some of the initial steps that we're taking were enough to help dampen the impact of epidemics like cholera. First steps were taken in America's cities. We got somewhere, but the quality of life that we're protecting with all this counts too. It's not just that we stop people from dying, it's that we provide them with an opportunity to live a healthful life, something with a quality of life that's worth talking about and thinking about. Please don't ever underestimate the persistence of the risk of non-fatal contagious diseases, things that may not kill you, but that still change your life and alter the course of how things go for you. It's 1921. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a rising politician, somebody with connections, somebody who's going somewhere in life, contracts polio. He's 39 years old. Now, polio is a challenging thing to deal with because it can be transmitted via close contact with another person. But it can also be transmitted via sewage. The virus enters through the mouth and multiplies throughout the gastrointestinal tract. Then it causes us to get sicker. The virus, usually we see, can be present for 1 to 2 weeks in your nose, right? And you can spread it from the nose. That's how you can get other people sick. But you can also shed it in stools. And the thing that we know about Franklin Delano Roosevelt is that at the time he contracted polio, he came down with an acute case. He got sick, noticeably so. He was with other people. Nobody else who was with him got sick from polio. He also, on this trip, when he got sick, was the only one who fell into the lake, fell off of a boat into lake water. And it was lake water into which people were discharging untreated sewage. The chances are very, very good that Franklin Delano Roosevelt contracted polio from sucking in water from a contaminated lake where there was sewage present. He probably got it there because if he'd gotten it from someone face to face, somebody else in his group probably also would have gotten sick at the time. We don't know about anybody else getting sick. We do know he fell into the lake. So he probably also got sick from dealing with infected water. Now, most people who get polio, who contract the virus, don't actually have any visible symptoms. So it's possible he may not have contracted it that way. But the reality is that some people, a fair number, get flu-like symptoms, and a small percentage, like FDR, contract the worst and most serious form of the disease and end up with paralysis. It all can be traced, though, back to water. We even see it today. We see fragments of polio still in water systems from time to time. Sometimes it's the inactivated virus that comes through when people get the wonderful vaccines that are available, but sometimes it's because there's live polio virus because people still get it in some places and can spread it. Somebody else who got sick living in Washington, D.C., in the White House at the time, is 1924. Calvin Coolidge Jr. dies of a staph infection. He'd been playing on the White House lawn. I believe he was playing on one of the tennis courts. Gets a staph infection. Now, do we know that the staph infection was something that he could have had protected himself from if he'd washed it carefully? He apparently had gotten an abrasion or a cut on his foot, and that's what killed him. Could he have cleaned it? Perhaps. Maybe water would have protected him from that. This wasn't, again, historically speaking, that long ago. My grandmother was in high school when this happened. This was enough, though, to cause Calvin Coolidge, his father, upon losing his son, to fall into a deep depression and didn't run for re-election, probably in part because the memories were simply too painful for him. It's one thing to be a good sport or to be humble about the work of water and wastewater treatment. It's one thing to, take pride in what you do without being puffed up about it. But the problem here is that every joke that comes along with being in this sector, every time people downplay what's going on, every time somebody makes a joke about people in wastewater being turd herders or anything like that, every time we let that slide, we're missing an opportunity to tell people, no, you may think that's funny, but the reality is that we are the front line protecting your health every single day. And so does every day that people take that safe drinking water for granted. If people aren't being told why this is so important, if they're not being told how many lives are being saved, it's hard for us to get the credit that we need to keep this sector working and moving in the right direction consistently. We've figured out a lot of the basics, but there's still a lot of work to be done, and there's always going to be ongoing maintenance and support to be done. And if we don't furnish that and we don't have the resources to do it, it's our fault if we're not telling the story. Water and wastewater work is dignified. It is life-saving. There is no substitute for it. It is irreplaceable. You have to ask yourself if you believe, just like these bond issues, this is a bond issue posted in 1920, endorsed by the Chamber of Commerce, vote for the water bond issue, vote for the bond issue and own your own waterworks. It is the best investment the city can enter into. Do you believe that today? If you're in the water and wastewater sector, you need to go to work every single day believing that water and wastewater infrastructure is the best investment a city can enter into. Because it is. It's protecting us daily from dreadful diseases that take lives and make other lives miserable. Celebrating that dignity of that work starts with us. It starts with everyone in the water and wastewater sector. Put your brand on everything. Be proud of it. Wear it with pride. Talk the business up. Don't talk yourself down. Share why it's so important and expect the same kind of treatment as other people who get called hometown heroes. The fire department can't fight fires without a good water supply. The police department can't show up to work every day if they don't have a place to wash their hands, brush their teeth, and take a shower. Nobody at the hospital is getting any work done unless there is clean, potable water and a way for the waste to go somewhere else. These are mission critical. And if these people are hometown heroes, then everyone working in water and wastewater needs to treat themselves and expect others to offer the same treatment to them as well, because they are literally upstream of everyone else we call a hometown hero. Now, I get that sometimes working in the water and wastewater sector can be unpleasant. People get queasy about bodily fluids and bad odors. Even the sight of a color like this can be enough to set some people off. The problem here is we can't let ourselves just be thrown off by mere incidental exposure to things, because who else deals with incidental exposure to things like body fluids and bad odors? Nurses and doctors and dentists and PAs and paramedics and sports trainers and coaches and pro athletes and teachers. All of these people are also exposed incidentally through the environment to body fluids and bad odors. Those things can happen, but that incidental environmental exposure that people get cannot be allowed to define the profession of water and wastewater work any more than it defines any of those other professions. A doctor is not defined by the most disgusting thing that happens in their work. We cannot let people in water and wastewater take any definition away from the most unpleasant aspects of the work. What has to matter is the mission. And that mission is essential. Your branding should be at least as prominent as that of any hospital or health clinic in your community. Are there billboards up at the local baseball park? If not, maybe there should be, because you're doing as much frontline work to protect health as people who are working directly in the medical sector. They can't do their jobs unless we do ours. And we prevent massive numbers of people from overloading their systems. That's the essential work of water and wastewater infrastructure. Your working environment should be at least as pleasant as that of the local fire department. Fire departments typically don't have a lot of difficulty telling people that, hey, our fire department, our fire station should look nice. It should look good. It should be a nice, clean place. We have to spend a lot of time there. We got to keep the trucks nice and clean. We got to do a lot of work. We need to be focused on getting quickly to the fire. So we need the right equipment. We need the right facilities. We need the right training rooms and exercise facilities and all of these other things. And they're right. But they're no more right than those people who work in the water and wastewater sector, who have equal claim to having those kinds of facilities, things that are good-looking and clean and pleasant places to work. It's not like this isn't something that's been a long time brewing. The founding fathers were, like most people of their time, probably half drunk most of the time in 1776. Clean drinking water simply wasn't available. You were lucky if you had a good water supply you could go to. A lot of time people had to drink alcohol because it was the only thing that was safe. That was a pretty big infringement upon people's general liberties. Today, you can face jail time in America if you fail to obtain or to maintain or uphold the laws that keep water safe. People go to jail if they break these laws, these regulations that we have in place to keep everybody safe. We're doing so much better than even the founding fathers were doing about respecting the importance of public health as it's delivered through clean drinking water. 1789 comes around, George Washington is inaugurated and has a single tooth in his head, a single remaining natural tooth in his head at the time he becomes President of the United States, the most lauded president that we have. This is because he didn't have access to things like fluoride. His water wasn't chlorinated, his water wasn't fluoridated, and he didn't have access to just basic dental hygiene, which is something that is delivered daily without a lot of respect oftentimes by the drinking water sector. This is the kind of thing that we are preventing. We're preventing people from reaching middle and older age without any teeth left, including our most prominent president. Bad things that don't happen, though, unfortunately for us, aren't automatically counted the same way as the bad things that do happen and then get corrected. It's our job to count the planes that don't crash, metaphorically speaking. Our sector has to remind the public routinely that we are in the business of preventing massive amounts of needless human suffering. It's human suffering. It's not environmental suffering. It is human suffering that we are preventing. And we need to make sure people know that on a regular basis. Because if you look at how contaminated water affects people's lives even today in all of these different countries, in all of these different places, war zones routinely have problems with water. Conflict areas, a natural source of this. Natural disaster regions. Anytime something goes wrong and the water supply gets disrupted, people suffer. And we're preventing that on a daily basis. And again, we're doing this with benefits that flow equally, whether the people receiving the water are rich or poor. Everybody benefits from public water systems that are well-maintained, well-operated, well-run. This is something we do consistently, but it's not free. That work isn't free. The maintaining work isn't free. The expensive operations isn't free. And the capital equipment isn't free. The public needs to be reminded constantly why those costs are worth paying. Even just to paint a water tower costs some money. It's not free. And if people expect it to be free, they're expecting all the wrong things. Don't ever, ever let up. Let people know constantly that you are protecting what they drink. It's not just about some kind of magical, esoteric thing that's out there. It's about saving lives from cholera and typhoid and dysentery and all these other dreadful things. Now, nobody's going to build you a statue. Nobody's going to get into this sector because they expect to be called a hero. That's just not how it works. But, like the Secret Service, your victories in the water and wastewater sector are all the bad things that don't happen. Really. That's what it comes down to. Your victories are succeeding in delivering safety without really being recognized for it, without getting to tell everybody that all these bad things could have happened. But we do have to tell some of that story. We have to explain why consistently, else we can't expect the public to appreciate that work and to do things like funding it adequately. Unlike the Secret Service, not only can you tell the public about your victories, you should. You should, at the very least, remind the public what we're really in the business of doing. Let's think about this scorecard here, comparing the water sector and the Secret Service. All the presidents of the United States lined up here, each represented by two icons, a water icon and a police figure icon. These are the presidents who died of bad drinking water. Here is James Garfield, who, we'll call it a 50-50 shot. Here are the presidents who suffered violent, serious assassination attempts or successful assassinations, starting with Lincoln. So we have, until we get to the middle here of the 20th century, we actually saw that about the same number suffered from those attacks. It's important to remember William McKinley got shot. Then we had Teddy Roosevelt suffering an assassination attempt after he was president of the United States. We also saw other assassination attempts take place against Ronald Reagan, a serious one, and against Donald Trump. Of course, we lost John F. Kennedy in the 1960s. So this is the scorecard. You'll note that once we began doing effective water treatment and distribution, this scorecard goes to 0 deaths. Nobody dies once we start doing the job right in the water sector. These are the bad things that didn't happen, for which the water and wastewater sector needs to take credit. Thank you very much for your time and attention.